Are you interested in learning a foreign language quickly at your own pace and while on the go? Well, check out wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket to learn more about rocket languages and to get a free trial version with over 4 hours of free lessons and other free content. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Ms. Julie Rehmeyer about her book, Through the Shadowlands, a science writer's odyssey into an illness science doesn't understand. Julie is an award-winning math and science writer and a contributing editor to Discover magazine. She has been published in numerous publications, including the New York Times and Science News, and has been featured on the History Channel and NPR. You can follow her work at throughtheshadowlands.com. You can find her on Facebook under her name Julie Rehmeyer. That's Julie Rehmeyer, Rehmeyer, and on Twitter at Julie Rehmeyer. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/shadowlands. Julie, welcome to the show.
I'm so glad to be here with you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us. So let's just start out with an overview of your book. So what sorts of things are covered in your book, and what's your motivation for writing this book?
So the book describes my personal journey with chronic fatigue syndrome, but it also it kind of uses my own experience as a way of talking about a lot of bigger issues. So chronic fatigue syndrome is a poorly understood illness, and there are a lot of dynamics that play out with these poorly understood illnesses that are kind of common to all of them. With chronic fatigue syndrome, or with Lyme disease, or with fibromyalgia, or even autoimmune diseases like lupus or multiple sclerosis. So one thing that the book is doing is it's looking at those dynamics and how science does not function as well as one would hope that it did with these poorly understood illnesses. It's also looking at kind of the personal transformation that took place for me as I wrestled with this illness. In particular, there's a kind of like fundamental reality that really we all have to deal with, that we only have so much control over our lives, and to some extent we simply are not in control. And, I think for most of us, the strategy that we use in dealing with that is that we put it out of our minds. We construct lives where we feel fairly in control, and we don't think about it. But with an illness like chronic fatigue syndrome, you don't know from day to day whether you're going to be able to function, and you also don't know like year to year. There was a point when I was so sick that it wasn't clear how I was even going to get by. So that kind of reality of not being in control is something that you can't ignore when you have an illness like this. So the book is really about kind of how I grappled with that reality, and how I was able to kind of construct a meaningful life for myself in face of the kind of constant awareness of my own lack of control.
Sure, and I want to take a closer look at the scientific research surrounding your illness, and some of the flaws with how science is conducted when looking at chronic fatigue syndrome and other similar illnesses. I want to look at that in a minute, but first, let's just have some background into chronic fatigue syndrome. You described some of the aspects of it and some of the issues that you've had to deal with as a result of having this illness, but what exactly is chronic fatigue syndrome, and just how many people are affected by this illness?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. So actually saying what chronic fatigue syndrome is surprisingly difficult. The hallmark symptom of the illness actually isn't fatigue at all. It's difficulties with exercise, and in particular, if you have chronic fatigue syndrome, then exercise makes you much worse the next day. It exacerbates all the symptoms of the illness. And the symptoms include extreme fatigue, though fatigue doesn't really capture it. The degree of fatigue is often just kind of staggering. There's a quote from the author Laura Hillenbrand that this disease is to fatigue as a match or as a nuclear bomb is to a match. And then there are also a variety of other things. So one thing that's extremely common among chronic fatigue syndrome patients is difficulty regulating blood pressure and heart rate when you stand up. And that's part of why patients feel terrible standing up and are much better off lying down. Cognitive problems are also typically part of the illness, and frequently neurological problems and immune problems in severe cases. Gut problems are very, very common and can be deadly, in fact.
Tell us a bit more about your personal story. When did these issues start happening to you?
Sure. So I started getting sick quite a while ago, back in 1999. And at the time, I didn't make too much of it. I was building my own straw bale house. I was working full time, and I was married to a man dealing with a very serious illness himself. So I was way overworked and overstressed, and kind of just figured, well, I'm exhausted all the time, but who wouldn't be? But it was also so extreme that didn't really quite feel like a sufficient explanation. You know, I'd find myself like trailing my hand along the wall as I walked because I was vaguely afraid I might pass out. That didn't just seem like being tired. But still, I pretty much figured, well, I just need to get my life in order and get my house finished, and I'll be fine. So I did finish my house, and I did get my life in order, and I wasn't really fine. I got a little bit better, but at that point, the thing that I noticed was that I couldn't exercise like I used to. I had always been really active. I'd run a marathon. I was on a search and rescue team. But after I started getting sick, I found that when I exercised, I just felt lousy and didn't enjoy it the way that I used to. But, you know, I again didn't make that much of it. I'd never heard of an illness that just caused problems with exercise. That just seemed so weird. And I hoped that it would just kind of gradually go away. But then in 2006, my symptoms started getting more alarming. And then late in the year, I woke up one morning and I could barely walk. It felt like the nerve signals weren't quite making it from my brain down to my legs. Like, it wasn't just that I was too tired to walk, though it did feel as though my legs had become about 300 pounds apiece. But it was more like there was something neurological going on. And of course I was terrified. You know, I had been feeling like, okay, something is clearly not quite right here, but this was on a whole other level. Like, okay, I am really sick. I have some terrible illness and I have to figure out what it is. And so I went to a neurologist, and the neurologist did some very, very simple tests, and then he diagnosed me with chronic fatigue syndrome. And I thought, you know, fatigue? Like, yeah, I've been tired for years, but this isn't fatigue. I can't walk. You know, didn't you notice I can't walk?
Yeah.
And for him, it was clear that that diagnosis meant, please get out of my office. You know, he had no tests, no treatments, no other doctors to refer me to, nothing.
Yikes.
Wow. Yeah, so clearly the research was lacking at the time. If there was no one else he could really turn you over to, no place he could suggest you go. But what exactly did the research say about chronic fatigue syndrome at that point? Because there must have been something to some degree, if there was at least a name for it, and he was able to look at your situation and say that you had chronic fatigue syndrome.
Right. So the research at that point had certainly identified a lot of fairly consistent abnormalities in chronic fatigue syndrome patients. One of the most consistent of them is that our natural killer cells, so these are a type of immune cell that are involved in fighting viruses and fighting cancer. Ours just are like all pooped out. They just don't work very well. And so that was a very consistent finding for a long time. And there were a bunch of other abnormalities that had been found, but they were kind of like, there were so many of them and they were so unrelated that it was really hard to know what to make of it. And then the other problem is that all of these studies were very small. And, small studies are just not reliable. So it was hard to know which of the studies even were true. It was pretty clear, like there was something going on with these patients, but really what that something was not so clear.
So how had the research been conducted, and what were some of the primary flaws, and how did the scientific research that had gone into chronic fatigue syndrome at that time compare to similar processes for researching other diseases?
The biggest problem is lack of funding, and that continues to be the biggest problem. So until very recently, the National Institutes of Health was spending about $5 million a year on chronic fatigue syndrome research, which is basically nothing. So, that's enough for a handful of smallish studies. Just to give you a sense, of scale, multiple sclerosis, which is similarly devastating, it affects about 40% as many people as chronic fatigue syndrome. Chronic fatigue syndrome affects about 1 million Americans, and multiple sclerosis affects about 400,000. Well, for multiple sclerosis, it's $300 million a year. So, really different scale. And that's about a typical amount of funding for a disease that has that's that devastating. The lack of research funding has for decades just throttled research in the illness. And so the biggest problem with the studies is simply that they're too small. It's too, you have to have a reasonable number of patients that you're studying to know that you're seeing a real signal and you're not just seeing random noise.
So was the biggest methodological issue just that there weren't enough people involved in these studies because of the lack of research, or were there some other methodological issues?
Exactly.
Were there other methodological issues as well?
Yes. So there were other methodological issues as well. The biggest one is that that the different studies don't use a consistent case definition, and there's been a lot. It's been the definitional issues are really a mess with chronic fatigue syndrome. With research, what you want to do is you want to have a tight definition so that you know that every patient you're studying really has the disease. So it may be that there are people who really have the disease who don't qualify for your study because they don't meet this tight definition that you're using, but that's okay. You don't have to include every patient out there, but you want to know that every patient you're studying really has the disease. But unfortunately, many of the definitions that are used are extremely broad. So an especially egregious example, this is somewhat later than when I was first diagnosed, but in 2011, a typically large study was announced, the findings were announced, that used a definition that simply requires 6 months of fatigue with no other symptoms required. So, think about, just think about who's been really, really tired for 6 months. Well, fatigue is a very common symptom in depression, and depression is a very common illness. So if you're looking at people who have been really, really tired for 6 months, you're going to get a lot of people who are actually just depressed and don't have chronic fatigue syndrome at all. And the study claimed that cognitive behavioral therapy and gradually increasing exercise are effective treatments for chronic fatigue syndrome that can lead to recovery. And, when you think about it, well, that's true of depression, right? Therapy and exercise are really good treatments for depression. But in fact, they're particularly gradually increasing exercise is an outrageously inappropriate treatment for chronic fatigue syndrome, given that the hallmark symptom of the disease is that exercise makes patients worse. And, in fact, the advice you should be giving patients with chronic fatigue syndrome is you need to learn to stop as soon as you feel tired. And there's this kind of skill that you have to develop as a patient of regulating your activity levels to make really sure that you never overdo it. And that's really central. So that study, it's called the PACE trial. It was extremely influential, and it's continuing to exert a very strong influence around the world. And it shows, among other things, how important it is to use a proper case definition, or you're just not looking at the right patients.
Right. So after your trip to the neurologist, what did you do then? Right, you were stuck. There really wasn't any place for you to go to. So what did you decide to do?
Yeah, well, so I turned to Dr. Google, the natural next step these days.
Right.
And I read a little bit about chronic fatigue syndrome that gave me a little bit more information, although I was not at all convinced that was the correct diagnosis for me at that point. I also found one specialist in chronic fatigue syndrome in the entire San Francisco Bay Area, which struck me as bizarre. Really? Only one? And so I went to him, and I was struck by the combination of things that struck me as total quackery and things that seemed to have some scientific basis. So, in his waiting room, he had brochures for acai berry juice that he sold in wine bottles for $35 a pop, with wild claims about the wonderful things it could do for your health. And he hawked anti-cellulite treatments. At the same time, when I actually went in and saw him, he cited studies to back up his recommendations, and in the long run, I thought many of his recommendations were, reasonable things to suggest that, in fact, were effective for some patients, though they didn't have much impact for me. So I felt as though I had fallen off the edge of the earth. I expected that if I ever got seriously ill, that doctors would probably have some, be able to say what I had, and it would be some proper illness, and there would be doctors who specialized in it who were there to treat me, who were mainstream established people, and there'd be a scientific literature, and there'd be, proper conferences and all of that kind of thing. And instead, I felt like I was in this world where the only people who seemed to have any expertise at all were these kind of shady characters. And it was a shocking experience for me.
And ultimately, you started finding out that that other people who had similar experiences and been through chronic fatigue syndrome themselves had discovered that mold was causing issues in their lives and was helping to create this illness and make it worse. So how did you come across the connection between mold and chronic fatigue syndrome? And how dangerous is this mold, and how prevalent is it? Where all can people find it?
Lots of good questions there. So in late 2010, so let's see, I got diagnosed in late 2006, and relatively rapidly figured out that doctors didn't have much to offer me, and so I just focused on kind of managing the illness for myself. And the real key for me that I found was just not overdoing it. And by being really careful, I was able to craft an altered and cautious but kind of semi-normal life. And went along that way, with some ups and downs for about 4 years. And then in late 2010, I was in a good spell, able to go for hikes of, even 3-4 miles. And then on one such hike, I was a mile from home and thought, I'm a little tired. And, I had to get home. And so I rested, and then I walked some more, and then I rested, and my rests got longer and my walking periods got shorter, but I had to get home. And by the time I got home, I was in pretty terrible shape, and I knew that I would pay. Well, I was right. I did pay. I paid with a year of being mostly bedbound, and often couldn't even turn over in bed. And so, I went off at that point to see top specialists. I, kind of did everything I could see to do, and none of it had much of an effect, and got to a point of real desperation. And so at that point, I managed to write I'm a science writer, so I managed to write a story about chronic fatigue syndrome for the online magazine Slate. And so in the process, I came out, as it were, as having the illness publicly for the first time. And so I got contacted by these patients who said that they had been as sick or sicker than I was and had taken extreme measures to avoid toxic mold and had these spectacular improvements. And I'll tell you, my first reaction when I heard this was, this is totally crazy. I was completely skeptical. I had never heard anything scientific to back up the idea that mold could cause problems like mine. I mean, I knew that it could cause asthma, but I got paralyzed. I didn't have breathing problems. And the other things I felt like, look, this is an illness that varies a lot. And so some patients just get better. And when you get better, it's really easy to look at whatever you were doing at the time that you got better and decide that it was the thing that made you better. And maybe it was, and maybe it wasn't. So, the fact that some patient thinks that doing X, whatever X is, had dramatic impacts on them, well, maybe, maybe not. And this just didn't sound plausible to me at all. So anyway, I was enormously skeptical, but at the same time, I came across a blog post from a young man who had tried this out, and he'd gone to the desert for 2 months living in a cargo trailer, and he posted pictures of himself running again. And this just blew my mind. At that point for me, exercise consisted of getting to the bathroom. And I missed exercise so much and just missed being able to have a life. And the other thing about it was that level of improvement is actually really rare among the patients who were as sick as I was. You heard stories of some treatment seeming to help somebody, but not to the point that they were running again. That was really, really, really astonishing to me. And so that got me thinking about it, even as much as I was skeptical, I couldn't completely dismiss it either. And the patients recommended that I go to the desert for 2 weeks with none of my own belongings to get clear of mold. And their prediction was that I might or might not feel better while I was there, but that when I came home, that I would react really clearly and strongly to where I was living and to my own stuff, which they said was all contaminated with mold. And so I was intrigued, and part of it was, it seemed like, okay, this is a testable experiment, it appealed to me on a kind of scientific level. And I was still extremely skeptical, but I'd also gotten to the point where I'd run out of reasonable options. So I kind of had to accept that whatever I was going to do at that point really was not going to be reasonable. So the short story is that I went to the desert and it all worked just as the patients had said. I got home. I reacted really clearly and strongly to my own stuff. 30 seconds was enough to leave me crippled afterward. And then the most incredible part for me was a week after I got back from the desert, I was able to hike up a 350-foot hill, which I hadn't been able to do for a year and a half. So at that point, my skepticism kind of went away. I sort of felt like, okay, this is so impressive. No, I wouldn't say my skepticism went away. I was still skeptical in various ways, but I was certainly, I was persuaded that this was something that I was going to pursue in a really serious way. And it continued to bring really, really dramatic health improvements. So that's kind of the story of how I became convinced that mold was playing a major role for me. You also asked about like prevalence, how many people are affected by this. And unfortunately, we really have absolutely no way of answering that question. And this comes down to another really serious scientific breakdown. So basically, the mainstream scientific view at this point is that mold can cause respiratory problems, but it can't cause serious neurological problems, at least not by breathing the air from water-damaged buildings. And the reasons for that being the kind of conventional position are complicated, but a significant factor actually is influence from the insurance industry. And this is a story that I tell in the book in some detail about how it is that the insurance industry had a huge influence on court cases, on public perception, and also on the course of scientific inquiry, even when they didn't have science, even when the science went against their claims. And it was really a shocking story for me. As a science writer, I had not anticipated that something like that could happen, and it was a real shock for me. So anyway, the kind of conventional scientific opinion is basically that my experience is impossible, and that I must be just experiencing a kind of nocebo effect, like the evil twin of the placebo effect, and that it's essentially all in my head. And I was basically directly told that by a number of scientists. And the interesting thing is that I actually very carefully tested for this myself. I did a placebo-controlled, double-blinded trial of my own ability to detect mold. So I got 2 identical packages of washcloths. I sent one to a house I had lived in that had visible mold, and had my friend who lived there spread the washcloths around the house for 2 weeks and then send them back to me. And I had one friend choose a contaminated or uncontaminated washcloth at random, hand it to my husband, who did not know whether it was contaminated or uncontaminated, and he brought it to me. And then I breathed through it and waited to see if it crippled me, and then declared it contaminated or uncontaminated. And I did this well enough that there was only a 2% chance that I could have done as well if I were just guessing. And so talking to scientists, when they said this must be a nocebo effect, then I told them about this test I did, which is exactly what, it's the exact test that you'd perform to figure out whether that's true. And they would all be kind of impressed by it, and then kind of stick with their theory that it still must be a nocebo effect. So it was very eye-opening to me to see how hard it is to change. To change scientists' views once they have been set. Scientists are human beings like the rest of us, So, in fact, in this situation, they did not have evidence to show that mold couldn't have neurological effects like mine. And in fact, we know that molds produce toxins that are powerful neurotoxins. And there's also evidence, there's direct evidence that mold does cause neurological effects. For example, a study of Polish school children showed that children who went to school in water-damaged buildings had, on average, 10 points lower IQ scores, which is really kind of shocking. But nevertheless, most mainstream scientists will say mold can't have serious neurological effects. And it's really kind of astounding.
If you are interested in learning a foreign language in a quick and efficient way, then check out Rocket Languages at wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket. Their courses allow you to learn on the go and make sure that you retain what you're learning. They'll explain everything from grammar and mechanics to culture to how to incorporate what you're learning into everyday conversations. And you'll have lifetime online access to teachers and native speakers every second of the day. Their prices are very reasonable compared to their competitors, and they offer courses in 13 different languages. Spanish, French, Italian, Chinese, German, Japanese, Russian, Arabic, Hindi, American Sign Language, Korean, Portuguese, and English. To start your free trial and mini course, check out wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket to start learning a foreign language quickly and at your own pace.
That must be kind of hard on you, telling someone something that you personally, you've experienced it, this is how it works, and they just kind of look at you and say, oh, well, I guess it must have been the 2%, right? Like,
right.
I'm sure that's got to be hard to hear. Why do you, why do you think that there is such a lack of funding? I know you compared it to cystic fibrosis earlier in the interview.
And multiple sclerosis, yeah.
Multiple sclerosis, sorry, my bad. And that this affects much more people. Why do you think it's just that it's more difficult to identify this, and that's the reason why there isn't as much, because you don't hear about this very often. Obviously, you hear about MS quite frequently.
Right. So there are kind of two different stories here with chronic fatigue syndrome and with mold illness, and they're related but somewhat different stories. So with chronic fatigue syndrome, you'll start to see the connections quickly based on what I've already said. But with chronic fatigue syndrome, there was an outbreak of it in the 80s that got fairly seriously studied, and it was what actually led the term chronic fatigue syndrome to be coined in the first place. And so there was a kind of brief period when it was taken seriously. And then, basically what happened was it did not immediately yield startling insights that made the physiology clear. The initial thought was, well, maybe it's an infectious disease or something like that. But then it didn't behave, they couldn't identify a pathogen that didn't behave quite the way they expected. And they got flummoxed pretty fast. And so there's an unfortunate pattern that unfolds time and time again when you have an illness that you can't immediately figure out. And it's that the patients get called crazy. The idea develops that this is primarily a psychological illness, and that's exactly what happened with chronic fatigue syndrome. And this got kind of promulgated in the press, and the idea really took hold. And then there was, partly as a response to that, or, who knows what all the dynamics were, the research funding was very, very limited, which of course then forms a cycle, because you're not going to figure out what's going on with the illness if you don't study it. And if you don't figure out what's going on with the illness, then people think, oh, it must just be psychological because we don't have a physiological explanation. So that's kind of the basic dynamic with chronic fatigue syndrome. With mold illness, there's a similar thing going on with it getting dismissed as psychological, as I was just saying. But in that case, we also have this very pernicious role that the insurance industry played, because this all became a really big issue after the energy crisis, when builders started tightening up homes, and all of a sudden entire office buildings of people, all of the workers started complaining that they got sick when they were at work and felt better when they went home. And that phenomenon, scientists came in to figure out what was going on, and there were a variety of problems that were all related to buildings that didn't breathe and hence had bad indoor air quality. And one of those issues was mold. And the insurance industry then got very, very, very worried. They had just come off of asbestos, paying huge sums because of asbestos. And the big fear was that mold would be the next asbestos. And so the insurance industry kind of went into high gear. And one of the ways that they responded to this was by promulgating this really anti-scientific idea that mold had no serious health effects, not even respiratory effects. And they managed to get official statements from professional organizations of doctors claiming this, even though even at that point we knew that mold had very serious respiratory effects. At this point, we know that mold is, in fact, the cause of 20% of asthma cases, which is a huge thing because asthma is very common and it can be deadly. So this is like actually a really, I mean, even dismissing people like me, mold is a really big deal in terms of its health impacts. And the insurance industry, really went to work casting aspersions on that idea in spite of the science. And the result was that the mainstream scientists who knew that mold had very serious respiratory effects ended up feeling caught in the middle. There was this huge rash of lawsuits. And so on one side, you had the insurance industry saying that mold could do nothing. And on the other side, you had people like me saying mold had all these huge health impacts. And the insurance people were actually going against the science, and people like me didn't have science to back them up because the science hadn't been done. And the scientists in the middle were saying, hey, wait, like mold causes these respiratory effects, and don't listen to those crazy insurance people. Don't listen to those crazy neurological people. Listen to us. So, the way it played out over the decades was that the scientists have, in large part, though not entirely, prevailed against the crazy insurance people. But the impact is that it's then very hard for them to open their minds to the crazy neurological people like me. It's because they had to work so hard to be heard about the respiratory effects of mold and saw both the insurance industry and the people like me as their enemies in getting that word out, then it's very hard for them to shift mode and say, hey, actually, maybe mold does have serious effects beyond what we have explored. So then the problem becomes that even when there are researchers who take that seriously and want to study it, they send their grant applications to the NIH, and the reviewers are the people who have decided this is all nonsense. And the result is that literally there is zero research funding, at least from the NIH, for non-respiratory effects of mold. So, it's so extreme that even when a researcher has found something really, really interesting and wants to follow it up, they can't do it. So I found three recent studies that showed entirely separate mechanisms by which mold was quite plausibly damaging our health outside the respiratory system. All three researchers had to give up their research because they couldn't get research funding. So the situation with mold, with non-respiratory effects of mold, is actually more grim than the situation with chronic fatigue syndrome. Things are starting to get better with chronic fatigue syndrome. The NIH has started paying more attention to it. They have started their own study. They've increased research funding a little bit. And some really great researchers have gotten interested. And, there are various things happening with chronic fatigue syndrome. I'm hopeful that in, say, a decade, the situation will be better. With mold illness, I am not optimistic about that.
So for someone who is pessimistic about the science surrounding mold illness and the trajectory that is taking, and who is pessimistic about the pace at which research into chronic fatigue syndrome is improving, for someone who's concerned about those things, are there any steps or resources that you recommend, and any resources in general that you recommend to someone who is worried about the way science is progressing or not progressing and feel that it's important that they themselves take control of their own health right now in the present?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the biggest piece of advice I would have, well, I guess two things. One is you have to accept that your doctor is not going to save you, and that science is not going to save you. And your doctor, doctors are still valuable. I'm not saying, give up on them. They're lousy. But they have to become a resource for you as you direct your own care, rather than you turning to them for them to fix you. So then, where do you go? Okay, so, what other resources are available? Well, really an enormous one is the patient community. And this is tricky because, of course, in online patient communities, there's all kinds of garbage, and you've got to be prepared for that. At the same time, there's also remarkable wisdom. The fact is, whatever you're dealing with, there are smart, thoughtful people out there who are dealing with the same thing, and your job is to find them. And if you have just gotten sick with something and there's somebody else who's been dealing with it for the last 2 decades, who is a savvy person, there's a good chance that one way or another they'll have figured out some strategies that are helpful. The internet is an amazing tool for finding them. You've also, of course, got to be very savvy then in evaluating the things that you hear. And as I say, there's all kinds of garbage on the internet, and that's tricky, trying to figure out what's garbage and what's not. And as I said in my own story, when I first heard about mold, I was enormously skeptical and thought it was almost certainly part of the garbage. And the things that helped me to kind of make the distinction were partly just getting to know the patients and, figuring out how reliable I found them, and being simultaneously exceedingly skeptical and radically open-minded. That combination was essential for me so that I could entertain that notion while at the same time kind of holding on to reality. So I'd really recommend that, turning to the patient community to kind of find a path forward.
Yeah, it definitely sounds overwhelming, but it also seems like one of the big themes behind our conversation today and the story that you tell in your book is the importance of taking control of your own health, because while doctors are often very valuable resources, as you mentioned, sometimes that doesn't do enough to help with whatever issues someone may be having health-wise. So while that's tricky, that does seem like a big takeaway from this discussion.
And I also really liked the idea of being skeptical, but also having an open mind. I think we can apply that to more than just, your health. You can apply that to all sorts of outlooks on life. Sometimes you hear something and you're like, that's a bunch of baloney. But, if you take a second and you think about it, sometimes it turns out to be a bit less baloney than you might have thought to begin
Right. Well, and the open-mindedness is kind of a precondition for learning something new.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you very much for joining us today. Just to remind listeners who may have forgotten, what are the best ways to follow your work?
So the book is Through the Shadowlands. Definitely recommend reading it. And my website for the book is throughtheshadowlands.com. I am on Twitter and on Facebook as Julie Rehmeyer. That's Rehmeyer. So Twitter, I'm at Julie Rehmeyer, and Julie Rehmeyer on Facebook.
Great. And just to remind listeners again, the name of the book we've been discussing today is Through the Shadowlands, a science writer's odyssey into an illness science doesn't understand. And the place to find links to that book is the show notes page, of course, for this episode, wakeupcallpodcast.com/Shadowlands. And in addition to links to Through the Shadowlands being on that page, there will also be links to the appropriate Facebook and Twitter pages and websites. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Shadowlands is the place to go for resources related to this episode. And I want to encourage everybody while they're at it to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher. And Julie, thank you so much for your time today and for discussing this topic that I knew very little about just a short time ago, and I'm assuming the same is true of Daniel, but it's a very important topic, and your story is definitely an important one. So hopefully we were able to spread some awareness and shed some light on this issue today, and best of luck with your book and continued success.
Thank you. I so appreciate it. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.